welcome back. Tonight we explore the dark biology, brutal history, and disturbing secrets behind Resident Evil's most terrifying creations, the Tyrants. Drop a comment below and tell me where you're listening from tonight, and what games you want me to cover next. Before we begin, feel free to like and subscribe, but only if you enjoy this kind of slow, immersive storytelling that unfolds like a dream. The Tyrant Project begins. In 1988, deep inside Umbrella's Arclay laboratory, a facility buried beneath the dense, fog-choked mountains outside Raccoon City, a new and particularly chilling chapter of bioweapons research quietly began. The project had a single monstrous ambition: to create the perfect human soldier, not through training or discipline, but through infection. Scientists working under the Tyrant Project aimed to take ordinary human beings, flood their bodies with a specially engineered variant of the T-virus, and guide the resulting mutations towards something that retained enough intelligence to follow orders while developing a body capable of destroying anything in its path. They called their creation the Tyrant, and that name was not chosen by accident. It was the same word used to describe the T-virus project itself, a deliberate signal that this creature was meant to represent the full, realized potential of Umbrella's most dangerous biological work. The 1 in 10 million problem. Before a single Tyrant could be successfully created, Umbrella's scientists ran headlong into one of the most fundamental obstacles in the entire project. Human beings, it turned out, were almost universally incompatible with the Tyrant creation process. The T-virus, in its standard form, tended to destroy the brain with relentless efficiency, rotting neural tissue, erasing higher cognition, and reducing subjects to the shambling, mindless figures that would later fill the streets of Raccoon City. For the Tyrant Project, that outcome was completely unacceptable. A bioweapon that couldn't follow orders was worthless. After extensive testing, researchers determined that only approximately 1 in every 10 million humans possessed the precise genetic profile needed to survive the infection process with their intelligence largely intact. That incomprehensibly narrow margin meant that simply rounding up test subjects at random yielded almost no usable results. It was a problem that would define the project's early years and push Umbrella toward increasingly desperate and brutal solutions. Convicts in the culture tanks, unable to simply wait for compatible subjects to present themselves, Umbrella arranged to have a number of convicted criminals transferred to the Arclay laboratory under the cover of standard prisoner relocation procedures. These men were stripped of any remaining legal protections the moment they entered the facility. They became test subjects in the truest, most clinical sense. Not patients, not volunteers, but raw biological material to be infected, monitored, and evaluated. The process involved carefully administering the T-virus to specific body parts and then performing invasive surgical modifications where the virus alone proved insufficient. Most subjects died during the procedure, or mutated into states that rendered them useless for the project's purposes. Because the 3 surviving early Tyrants were designated T-001, T-002, and T-011. Records suggest there could have been as many as 11 test subjects in the initial rounds, though the exact number has never been confirmed in surviving documentation. The T-001, the overdose that taught Umbrella everything. The first creature to survive the Tyrant creation process and reach something resembling completion was the T-001, later nicknamed the Proto-Tyrant, and it was, by almost every measure that mattered, a catastrophic failure. The research team had administered too high a concentration of the T-virus during the initial infection, and the results were deeply unflattering. The T-001 developed a severely compromised nervous system, an acute and grotesque exfoliation of its epidermis, meaning the creature's skin was essentially peeling and dying across its entire body, and a level of intelligence so degraded that it couldn't follow even simple commands. What it could do was fight with a raw, terrifying ferocity that genuinely disturbed the laboratory staff who observed it. It demonstrated raw physical power that made the name Tyrant feel appropriate even in failure. Umbrella's response was to place it in storage at Nest, their second underground facility, and mark it for disposal. It would remain there, waiting in cold silence, until the events of Resident Evil Zero dragged it back into the light years later, William Birkin, and the T-002. The failures of the T-001 were not wasted. Every flaw in that first creature became a data point, and the research team, now under the direct oversight of a young and frighteningly gifted scientist named Dr. William Birkin, used that information to refine their process for the next model. Birkin was, at the time, one of Umbrella's most prized scientific assets, a child prodigy who had graduated from the Umbrella Executive Training Center and rapidly established himself as a visionary in viral bioweapons research. Under his guidance, the team adjusted their methods, administering the T-virus in carefully controlled amounts, targeting specific body parts rather than flooding the whole system at once, and supplementing infection with surgical modifications designed to preserve as much neural function as possible. The result was the T-002, a creature that held a sufficient level of intelligence for following and executing commands, and that displayed what Umbrella's own files described as a high measure of perfection in combat ability. It was officially designated Tyrant, the same name as the virus and the project, as an explicit symbol that this creature represented the realized potential of everything they had been working toward. The Epsilon strain accident. On May 11, 1998, a quiet morning in the Arclay laboratory turned into something far more complicated when a newer variant of the T-virus, designated the Epsilon strain, escaped containment during ongoing work on the T-002 and T-011 subjects. The cause was linked to a manipulative sentient research specimen known as the Queen Leech, which had its own reasons for wanting the facility to descend into chaos. The Epsilon strain spread through the lab as an airborne pathogen, and within hours the facility was under full quarantine. Personnel were ordered into positive pressure personnel suits regardless of their duties. The accident created a cascading crisis that would eventually force the evacuation of critical research materials, including the cloned embryo of the T-002, removed by Dr. Birkin to ensure the Tyrant project would survive, even if the facility didn't. That single decision, that quiet act of preservation in the middle of a biohazard crisis, was the seed from which every mass-produced Tyrant in Umbrella's subsequent history would grow. The surgical heart, one of the most disturbing details buried in Umbrella's research files, concerns what the Arclay team did to the T-002's circulatory system during development. Standard human anatomy wasn't sufficient for the kind of physical demands the Tyrant was expected to meet in combat, so the research team performed a major surgical operation and grafted a large animal heart onto the creature's right chest cavity. This gave the T-002 an entirely second circulatory system, a redundant biological pump that could sustain the creature through damage that would be immediately fatal to any ordinary human. The graft was visible externally, a grotesque protrusion that would become one of the most recognizable design elements in Tyrant biology. Later, Tyrant models, including the T103 line, would have their cardiovascular systems engineered genetically rather than through surgery, making the exposed heart an inherited but evolved characteristic across the entire bloodline. The power limiter and the coat. During the development of the T002, Umbrella encountered a problem that would shape every Tyrant design that followed: uncontrolled mutation. The T-virus, even when successfully administered to a compatible subject, had a tendency to keep working. Without intervention, the biological changes would continue past the point of usefulness, shifting the creature away from the controlled, intelligence-preserving form Umbrella needed, and towards something unrecognizable, unpredictable, and impossible to command. To address this, Umbrella's engineering team developed what they called the power limiter, a device designed to suppress the progressive mutation tendencies inherent to T-virus infection and keep the Tyrant stable in its combat-capable form. The now iconic long black trench coat worn by T103 models is, at its core, this device. The coat isn't decoration or intimidation, though it achieves both. It is a functional suppression mechanism, a biological and mechanical restraint that the Tyrant wears on its body at all times to remain controllable. When the coat is destroyed, by fire, by enough concentrated damage, by the right kind of structural compromise, the suppression fails and the creature begins its final violent transformation. The Super Tyrant, when the limiter breaks. The transformation that occurs when a Tyrant's power limiter is destroyed has been witnessed across multiple incidents and documented in Umbrella's own files as a consistent, terrifying pattern. Muscle mass increases dramatically. Claws tear through the skin at the fingers, growing long and blade-like. The heart, already enlarged or grafted or prominent, swells further and shifts outward through the chest wall. The creature that was once capable of following orders becomes something closer to pure biological violence. Stronger, faster in short bursts, and utterly indifferent to whatever mission it had been assigned. Intelligence diminishes sharply during this final mutation. The T002's Super Tyrant form, witnessed on the helipad of the Arclay laboratory by the surviving STARS members, required a direct rocket launcher strike to stop. T00's transformation in the depths of Nest during the Raccoon City outbreak followed the same grim pattern, triggered by the structural damage of an explosion that destroyed the upper portion of its coat, and ended the same way, with a rocket from Ada Wong's launcher dropping onto the elevator platform. The Super Tyrant is, in Umbrella's own clinical assessment, a failed product. It is what happens when their science escapes their control. Albert Wesker's calculated betrayal. The T002 did not simply emerge, kill things, and die on the Arclay laboratory helipad by accident. Its release was orchestrated by Albert Wesker, Umbrella's own captain within STARS, who had spent years quietly positioning himself to betray the corporation and sell its biological research to a rival organization. Wesker's plan required him to collect combat data on the T002 by pitting it against STARS survivors, his own teammates, people who trusted him. He also needed to fake his death convincingly enough that Umbrella wouldn't hunt him. He had already secretly injected himself with a prototype virus handed to him by Dr. Birkin, one specifically designed to resurrect him after death with enhanced physical capabilities. He released the T-002 with the knowledge that it could attack him, apparently accepting that risk as part of the plan. What happened next, however, may have been something Wesker hadn't fully anticipated. The T-002 recognized him as a participant in the experimentation that had mutated it and turned on him first, driving its claw through him before it ever moved toward the star's members it had been ostensibly released to kill. Wesker survived, mutated, and escaped. Whether the creature's decision to attack its creator before its designated targets was something Wesker planned for, or a variable he simply accepted, the canon doesn't say with certainty. But the fact that a tyrant singled out its maker in the first moment of its freedom is one of the most quietly chilling details in its entire history. The Golden Tyrant of the Saturn version. In a detail that exists entirely outside the main game canon, but sits somewhere between fascinating and deeply strange, the Sega Saturn port of the original Resident Evil introduced a second tyrant into the Culture Tank Room encounter. If the player chose to experience the game as Chris Redfield, defeating the first T-002 would cause a second, identical creature to rise from an additional containment capsule. This second tyrant was not identical in color to the first. It was gold, a shimmering, deeply unsettling golden variant that otherwise behaved the same way, possessed the same exposed anatomy, and could be dispatched through the same methods. No in-universe explanation was ever offered for its golden coloration. It is a piece of Resident Evil history that most players never encountered, tied to a specific version of the game on hardware that never achieved the commercial success Capcom had hoped for, and quietly left behind as the series moved forward. The 6 Tyrants over Raccoon City. On the night of September 29th, 1998, as the T-virus outbreak had already reduced most of Raccoon City to a burning graveyard populated by the dead, Umbrella made a decision that crystallized exactly how the corporation viewed human life. 6 T-103 Tyrants were loaded onto an SH-60B Seahawk helicopter and dropped over the city. 5 of them were deployed directly into active combat zones to test their effectiveness in real battle conditions against the US military forces that had begun moving into the area. These 5 Tyrants were effectively performance tests in a human disaster that Umbrella itself had helped engineer. The 6th, designated T-00, later known by the nickname Mr. X, was given a specific mission: locate and recover a G-virus sample from the pendant worn by a young girl named Sherry Birkin, daughter of the scientist who had developed that virus, and eliminate any surviving police officers or civilians sheltering in the Raccoon City Police Department. T-00 was not a test. It was an operative. Mr. X and the satchel nobody noticed. In both the original Resident Evil 2 and its 2019 remake, players who look carefully at T-00's design will notice a brown leather satchel attached to the right hip of his trench coat. It is small, practical, and easy to miss against the mass of his imposing silhouette. That satchel was not decorative. It was designed specifically to hold the G-virus sample that T-00 was sent into Raccoon City to retrieve. A biological container disguised as part of an ensemble that was itself disguised as a coat. The fact that T-00 never actually acquired the sample means the satchel remains empty throughout every encounter in the game, a quiet detail about an objective that was never completed. In the 2019 remake, that satchel was removed from the design, one of the subtle changes that came with reimagining T-00's silhouette as slightly more compact and modern feeling. 1 Tyrant, not many. For players who first experienced the Resident Evil 2 remake in 2019, one of the persistent questions during the game's opening hours was whether the building contained multiple tyrants. Mr. X would appear in one part of the police station and then seemed to materialize in another, almost impossibly quickly. Players reported losing track of him entirely, turning a corner and finding him exactly where they least expected. The game director, Kazunori Kadoi, directly confirmed in post-release interviews that there was only ever a single T-00 in the building. The illusion of omnipresence was achieved through clever AI design. When out of the player's line of sight, T-00 moved at approximately 4 times his standard walking pace, rapidly repositioning to close the gap. He was not cheating with teleportation. He was simply moving through the building faster than players realized, with the camera conveniently looking elsewhere. The resulting effect of something enormous and deliberate closing in from every direction at once became one of the most discussed horror mechanics in the genre. The Terminator connection. The developers of the Resident Evil 2 remake have acknowledged openly that T-00 was designed with the Terminator in mind. The T-800 from James Cameron's 1984 film. A relentless, nearly indestructible machine that pursues its target without hesitation and cannot be reasoned with, provided a direct inspirational reference for what the team wanted Mr. X to feel like. The thematic overlap is difficult to miss. Both are imposing humanoid figures in dark clothing. Both pursue a single target with single-minded purpose. Both absorb damage that would kill anything else and simply continue walking. The T in T-00's designation even echoes the naming of Cameron's fictional machines, though whether that parallel was intentional in the original 1998 design is not confirmed. What is confirmed is that for the remake, the development team leaned into that aesthetic deliberately, wanting T-00 to feel like the arrival of something unstoppable, a presence that changed the rules of survival the moment it entered the building. The cloning source, Sergei Vladimir's DNA, perhaps the most remarkable and deeply personal origin story in the entire history of Umbrella's Tyrant program, concerns the T-103 line, the mass-produced model that included Mr. X, T-078, the Ivan bodyguards, and ultimately the genetic foundation for Nemesis. All of those creatures, every single one of them, trace their genetic origin back to a single man, Colonel Sergei Vladimir, a former Soviet military officer who had risen to become one of Umbrella's most fanatically loyal executives. Sergei was one of a very small group of individuals who possessed the rare genetic profile that made clean Tyrant creation possible. A 1 in 10 million compatibility that Umbrella had previously been unable to replicate through any reliable process. Oswell E. Spencer, Umbrella's founder, personally approached Sergei and asked him to donate his clones to the program. Sergei has described this decision as deeply painful. He had come to see those 10 cloned individuals as his brothers. He gave them up anyway. The decision broke the entire compatibility bottleneck. 10 compatible hosts, the development of a new T-virus strain that dramatically broadened the eligibility pool, and the T-103 line followed directly. Every mass-produced Tyrant Umbrella ever sold carries, at its core, a piece of a Soviet colonel who described those clones as his brothers, the people he had known, in some sense, as family. The Sheena Island factory, teenagers without anesthesia. Once Sergei's genetic contribution unlocked the possibility of mass production, Umbrella needed a facility capable of generating Tyrants at scale. That facility was constructed on Sheena Island, a remote Umbrella-controlled location that became known internally as the Tyrant plant. The production process, however, required a biological ingredient that could not simply be synthesized in a lab, a neurotransmitter called beta-heterononserotonin, an adrenal compound secreted specifically by the locus ceruleus region of the brain, and present in usable concentrations only in adolescents experiencing extreme fear. The extraction process required subjects to be kept fully conscious and unanesthetized. Their skulls opened, the compound harvested directly, because the presence of anesthesia dramatically reduced the concentration of the substance. To supply this, Umbrella abducted teenagers from across the world, targeting individuals from impoverished regions or social circumstances that made their disappearances difficult to investigate. The Sheena Island facility processed these young people as raw material, their suffering literally manufactured into the biological compound that made mass tyrant production viable. This is not speculation in the game's files. It is stated plainly. The tyrant that walked through the halls of the Raccoon City Police Department was built, in part, from the harvested terror of abducted children. T011 and the TALOS ambition. Not all tyrant research aimed simply to create a better soldier. The T011, one of the 3 original subjects from the Arclay laboratory, alongside T001 and T002, was evacuated from the facility in July 1998 by Colonel Sergei Vladimir specifically for a different kind of project. The Arclay team had been developing an answer to Umbrella Europe's Nemesis program, a competing bioweapons branch that had taken a very different approach to the intelligence problem. Their answer was the TALOS, the Tyrant Armored Lethal Organic System. The concept was startling. Instead of trying to make a smarter tyrant, they would make an unstoppable one by grafting powered military armor directly onto a tyrant host body. The T011 would become the chassis. Computer-controlled armor modules, internal reinforcement implants, and long-distance homing weaponry would be bolted and fused onto living biological material, creating something that could engage armored vehicles and military helicopters with reasonable kill ratios. Something a standard tyrant, for all its physical gifts, could not reliably do. The result was one of the most heavily armed single organisms in Umbrella's entire documented research history. The Nemesis Project's 10-year road, the parasite that would eventually become the defining component of the Nemesis T-type, had been in development for over a decade before it was successfully implanted into a T-103 host. Umbrella Europe's research team, working at their No. 6 laboratory, began the project in the late 1980s with a deceptively simple concept. If the T-virus consistently destroyed higher brain function, the solution was to replace the brain entirely, not with a mechanical device, but with another organism. A parasite specifically engineered to serve as an external, highly intelligent control system that could be implanted into an existing bioorganic weapon. The parasitic species they developed was called N-E-alpha. In early prototypes, it was capable of exactly the kind of intelligent control the project required. The problem was that every host it was implanted into died within approximately 5 minutes. The parasite was simply too powerful, too aggressive, too metabolically demanding for any BOW that existed at the time to survive the coupling. Scientists worked on refinements for years, testing on Cerberus specimens and hunter variants, gathering data, adjusting the parasite's aggression and metabolic demands. Progress was slow. Documentation from the RE podcast and Project Umbrella indicates the Nemesis project suffered from limited funding. Corporate executives apparently considered mass production of standard tyrants a more commercially viable priority, which, based on what we can reconstruct, kept the parasite research chronically under-resourced relative to its ambition. The Nemesis project survived on the conviction of its researchers and the occasional data breakthrough. It would take a compatible host, a fully developed T103, to finally make it work. Lisa Trevor and the G virus accident. Before a tyrant host existed that could survive bonding with the NE alpha parasite, Umbrella Europe sent a prototype specimen to the Arclay laboratory in the United States to be tested on whatever subjects were available. The subject chosen was Lisa Trevor, a young woman who had been held in Umbrella captivity for years, subjected to repeated viral experiments, and who had developed a biological makeup so mutated and unusual that conventional viral behavior simply did not apply to her. When the NE alpha parasite was implanted into Lisa, researchers expected one of two outcomes: successful parasitization or rapid death. What happened instead was neither. Lisa's heavily mutated immune system did not succumb to the parasite, nor did the parasite successfully take control. Instead, her body consumed it entirely, absorbed it into her own biological matrix, and broke it down. The parasite was destroyed. Its influence, however, was not fully erased. Elements of the NE alpha's genome were spliced into Lisa's already extraordinary biology, and the resulting interaction produced an unexpected biological profile. Based on what the law has since revealed, this data appears to have provided the earliest indicator of what would become the G virus, one of the most dangerous biological agents Umbrella ever developed. The attempt to control a tyrant's brain through parasitism had, in effect, given William Birkin data that pointed towards something entirely different and considerably more catastrophic. Nemesis, surgery, stitches, and staples. When Umbrella Europe finally achieved a successful implantation of the NE alpha parasite into a T103 host, the results were a triumph of engineering wrapped in something that looked like a crime scene. The NE alpha, upon bonding with the tyrant's spinal column and beginning its process of forming a supplemental brain alongside the host's existing neural tissue, immediately began to affect the creature's body in ways the research team had not fully anticipated. The parasite's tentacles were long, far longer than the T103's body could comfortably contain, and they tore through the surface of their host during the coupling process. The face was ripped open. The right arm and shoulder were split. The chest and abdomen showed ruptures where tentacle mass pushed outward through skin and muscle. Development staff were required to staple and suture the flesh back together by hand, stitching a tyrant's shredded body into something that could function and be deployed. In the process, the host tyrant lost its nose, its lips, and its right eye. The resulting creature, the Nemesis T-type, was never going to pass any visual inspection for normalcy. The haphazard seals and restraints covering its body in the 2020 remake are a direct acknowledgement that this creature is a prototype, a thing assembled from two incompatible organisms forced to coexist through science and surgical thread. The dual brain architecture, the intelligence that made Nemesis so dramatically more dangerous than any previous tyrant model, came from a specific biological mechanism that the project's lead researcher Kawamura described as functioning something like a dual-core processor. The NE alpha parasite, once successfully bonded to the host's brainstem, did not simply override the existing neural tissue. It formed its own brain, a second, fully developed cognitive organ, sitting alongside the first, connected to it, and sharing the cognitive load. The tyrant's original brain, compromised by the T-virus like all its predecessors, contributed what it could. The parasite's brain supplied the rest. Together, the two systems produced a level of intelligence and decision-making capability that significantly exceeded any standard T-103. Nemesis could interpret complex mission parameters, adapt its tactics to changing circumstances, and operate for extended periods without requiring any external direction or command signal. It could also do something no tyrant before it had been able to do: acquire and operate human weaponry with a kind of competence that would require specialized training in a human soldier. The only tyrant that could talk. Across all of Umbrella's tyrant research, across every model from the failed T-001 to the mass-produced T-103 line, to the specialized experimental variants developed in secret laboratories around the world, only one specimen has ever been documented as capable of speech. That specimen was the Nemesis T-type, and its vocabulary was limited but deliberate. Upon acquiring visual confirmation of its designated target, Nemesis would announce that target's name aloud. In the case of the Raccoon City deployment, the word it had been programmed to recognize and repeat was a single word: stars. The sound of that word in Nemesis's ruined, barely human voice, emerging from a face that no longer had lips, from a body sewn together with industrial thread, became one of the most immediately recognizable sounds in survival horror. It was a demonstration of the parasite's intelligence filtering down through the host's damaged vocal architecture. Nemesis was not simply parroting a sound. It understood the category of targets it had been sent to find and could verbally identify them: the rocket launcher and the minigun. Nemesis arrived in Raccoon City equipped with a rocket launcher mounted on its left arm, a shoulder-fired weapon that it could operate with the kind of precision that required conscious tactical decision-making. It used this weapon not simply to fire at targets at close range, where the blast radius would have been as dangerous to itself as to its quarry, but to engage at distances and from angles that demonstrated genuine understanding of ballistic weapons use. In the events of Resident Evil 3, it successfully downed a UBCS helicopter using the launcher, a single, calculated shot at a moving aerial target. In the non-canonical Resident Evil Operation Raccoon City, Nemesis was equipped with a minigun, demonstrating that the principle of an intelligent tyrant capable of operating complex weapons systems had been established firmly enough in canon to extend across multiple weapon types. No other tyrant in the series was ever documented using firearms of any kind. The standard model's combat advantage was entirely physical. Only Nemesis combined that physical dominance with ranged weaponry competence. The coat as straitjacket. The long coat worn by Nemesis in Resident Evil 3 differs significantly in purpose and construction from the coats worn by standard T-103 models, even though both serve as power limiters. On a standard T-103, the coat is a containment garment that suppresses runaway mutation, essentially a passive restraint. On Nemesis, the coat's design was more complex, because the NE alpha parasite significantly enhanced the creature's regenerative capabilities beyond what was standard for a T-103. The mutations that the parasite's secretions triggered were more pronounced and less predictable. The chest device visible in the 2020 remake specifically regulates the parasite itself, keeping it from becoming too biologically aggressive and preventing it from overwhelming the host body's structural integrity. The coat in that design is covered in restrictive gear, warning labels, and mechanical fastenings from head to toe, because this creature, prototype that it is, would pose a containment risk even to Umbrella if fully unrestrained. It is less a garment and more a mobile cage. The Raccoon City Revenge Mandate. The Nemesis T-type was not deployed in Raccoon City as a general military asset. It was sent there with a specific, targeted mission that Umbrella Europe had designed as both a practical weapons test and a corporate act of retaliation. The surviving members of STARS, the Raccoon City Police Department's Special Tactics and Rescue Service, had investigated the Arclay Laboratory incident in July 1998, witnessed the T-002 in action, and escaped to tell the story. Their testimony represented an existential threat to Umbrella. From Umbrella Europe's perspective, deploying Nemesis specifically against those survivors served a dual purpose. It eliminated witnesses who threatened Umbrella's legal and financial position, and it generated combat data on the Nemesis T-type fighting against experienced armed opponents in a real-world environment rather than a controlled laboratory. Brad Vickers, one of the STARS pilots, was killed early in the deployment. Jill Valentine, the primary quarry, survived, but she was infected with a strain of T-virus during one confrontation, incapacitated for a period, and forced into a drawn-out conflict across the burning ruins of the city she had tried to protect. The parasite's survival instinct and Nemesis's final form. Through the events of Resident Evil 3, Nemesis sustained damage that accumulated beyond what even the parasite's extraordinary regenerative abilities could efficiently repair. At a certain point in the creature's deterioration, the NE alpha parasite underwent a fundamental shift in behavior. The artificial intelligence of the mission, the directive to hunt and kill STARS members, was overridden by something more primal: survival. The parasite, having been pushed past its biological limits, began operating according to instinct rather than programming. The host tyrant's body was rejected. What remained was the parasite itself in its final, fully mutated state. A massive, fleshy, crawling mass of tentacles and organic matter that bore almost no resemblance to the humanoid creature it had been moments before. It still moved toward its target. Even in this degraded, instinct-driven state, stripped of intelligence and reduced to raw predatory biology, it continued trying to complete its mission. The corrosive chemicals at Nest 2's treatment plant were ultimately required to destroy it, and even that only weakened it enough for Jill Valentine's railgun shot to finish the process. The Ivan bodyguards, white coats, colored visors. Among the T-103 variants produced from Sergei Vladimir's genetic material, 2 were never intended for sale or deployment in combat zones. They were created for a single, personal purpose: to protect Colonel Sergei Vladimir himself. These 2 tyrants, designated even, were re-engineered versions of the standard T-103, modified to serve as bodyguards with a greater capacity for social integration and tactical judgment. Their visual design immediately distinguished them from their mass-production counterparts. Where standard T-103 models wore dark leather trench coats as power limiters, the Ivans wore white coats, white boots, and black gloves, and each wore a distinctive visor, one with red lenses, one with blue. The visors functioned as head-mounted displays, supplementing their already enhanced cognitive systems with additional data. Significantly, unlike their standard T-103 counterparts, the Ivans had been specifically modified to no longer undergo the Super Tyrant transformation when their coats were damaged. Sergei didn't want his bodyguards becoming uncontrolled mutations in the middle of a crisis. He wanted them to remain operational and focused, even under extreme duress. The Ivans sent to kill Wesker. Albert Wesker crossed Colonel Sergei Vladimir's path twice, and both times the Ivans were deployed against him. The first encounter took place at the Umbrella Executive Training School in 1998, where Sergei personally intercepted Wesker after he was caught attempting to leave with stolen data in the chaos following James Marcus's revenge attack on the facility. Sergei ordered the Even to punish Wesker, a word choice that implies the intended outcome was not necessarily death, but a lesson. Wesker, still human at this point, barely escaped when an explosion within the facility provided the distraction he needed. The second encounter came in 2003, when Wesker infiltrated Umbrella's Caucasus facility in Russia, this time carrying the enhanced physical capabilities granted by his own viral mutation. Sergei deployed both Ivans simultaneously. Wesker, now moving with superhuman speed and striking with superhuman strength, disabled both creatures without serious difficulty. The Ivans that had been weapons of quiet dread when Wesker was human were entirely inadequate against what Wesker had become. Sergei's own transformation. The story of Sergei Vladimir ends in a way that draws a dark circle back to the beginning of the entire Tyrant project. When Wesker cornered him in the Caucasus facility, and the Evens had already been defeated, Sergei did not attempt to flee or negotiate. He injected himself with a perfected strain of the T-virus, the same fundamental substance his genetic material had helped make mass-producible and transformed. His arms fused together into a single enormous tentacle limb ending in a dangerous organic claw. His physiology shifted into something that bore the marks of the same viral architecture that had built every Tyrant in Umbrella's catalogue. He had always seen the T-103s as his brothers. Now he had become something similar himself, in the final moments of his life, in a facility that was collapsing around both of them. Wesker destroyed him. The man who had donated his own genetic identity to make mass Tyrant production possible died as a Tyrant, and the data Wesker extracted from the facility marked the end of Umbrella as a functioning organization. T-078, the Tyrant without a leash. Not every T-103 variant shipped out of the Sheena Island facility was equipped with a power limiter coat. One specimen in particular, assigned the batch designation T-078, was delivered to Rockford Island with its limiter deliberately disabled, specifically to document what mutations would develop in a T-103 that was never suppressed. The result was not the standard Super Tyrant clawed form that most T-103s developed under duress. Instead, T-078 developed blunted, heavily reinforced arm formations that functioned as battering rams, dense biological hammers rather than slashing claws, suggesting that the specific expression of T-103 mutation under the limiter's absence was not entirely predictable and varied by individual. T-078 was delivered to Rockford Island storage under the supervision of Umbrella Security Service operative Hunk, then activated by the island's unhinged commander, Alfred Ashford, with orders to kill Claire Redfield and Steve Burnside. It was relentless, persistent, and apparently incapable of being permanently halted by conventional firearms. It survived Claire's assault on the island, regained consciousness, and grabbed onto the transport plane as it took off. The final confrontation occurred in the plane's cargo bay, where Claire used an unsecured cargo crate to force the Tyrant off the aircraft over open ocean. The Hypnos gene, natural selection as a weapon. While most Tyrant development focused on improving control, intelligence, or physical capacity, the Hypnos T-type project pursued something fundamentally different. It was conceived by Commander Vincent Goldman, the supremacist director of the Sheena Island facility, who believed that the way to build a superior Tyrant was to let natural selection do the work inside the creature's own body. The Hypnos gene, when introduced into an organism's genetic makeup, killed weaker cells, not through infection or toxicity, but through a kind of programmed biological competition, forcing continuous cycles of cellular death and replacement in which only the most robust cells survived. This process was run artificially at an accelerated pace, repeated hundreds of thousands of times across 3 continuous weeks of biological cycling, leaving only the hardiest possible cellular foundation for the resulting creature. The neurotransmitter beta-heterononserotonin was also incorporated, the same compound harvested from terrified teenagers to enable T103 mass production, to ensure the resulting creature would be not merely strong, but ferociously aggressive. Goldman believed the Hypnos T-type would be his ticket to the upper echelons of Umbrella. Only one was ever produced. It was destroyed when private investigator Ark Thompson, deployed to Sheena Island, fired a helicopter-mounted Sidewinder missile directly into its exposed heart cavity after a prolonged and brutal confrontation. Thanatos, the unique one. Most Tyrant research at Umbrella operated on a principle of reproducibility. The goal was creatures that could be cloned, mass-produced, and deployed at scale. Thanatos, developed by a rogue Umbrella researcher named Dr. Greg Mueller during the Raccoon City outbreak, deliberately broke that principle. Mueller used a unique human subject, an African-American adult male, rather than the cloned embryos that form the basis of the T103 line, as the foundation for his creation. The resulting Tyrant bore the visual signature of the earliest Arklay models, including an exposed grafted heart similar to the T-002, alongside a set of enormously enlarged hands that functioned as both blunt force weapons and stabbing instruments. What distinguished Thanatos most was its speed. Standard T-103 models were powerful but deliberate in their movement. Thanatos was fast in a way that made evasion genuinely difficult, with jumping capabilities that allowed it to close distances rapidly and reposition in ways that broke the usual logic of Tyrant encounters. When Umbrella learned of Muller's research, the corporation wanted to mass-produce the design. Mueller, who appears to have had complex feelings about the creature he built, resisted this plan. The Raccoon City sterilization ensured neither ambition was realized. The Tyrant C and Tyrant R, Raccoon City's hidden experiments. The destruction of Raccoon City in October 1998 did not just eliminate civilians and Umbrella infrastructure. It erased ongoing bioweapons experiments that have remained only partially documented in surviving records. Among these were the Tyrant C and Tyrant R, 2 experimental Tyrant variants that were being developed within Raccoon City's research facilities at the time of the outbreak, separately from the T-103 line being mass-produced on Sheena Island. The Tyrant R, which appeared in Resident Evil Outbreak File 2 and later in the Umbrella Chronicles, represented a subspecies of the T-103 with specific modifications to its physical profile. These creatures were products of parallel development tracks that Umbrella pursued simultaneously. Different teams, different facilities, different design philosophies, all converging on the same fundamental question of how to make the Tyrant more effective. The city's destruction terminated these projects before they could reach commercial viability, and the creatures themselves were consumed by the sterilization along with everything else. The Bandersnatch, failure monetized. Not every human subject Umbrella tested during the Tyrant project possessed the genetic compatibility required to produce a functional Tyrant. The vast majority didn't. Rather than simply discarding the data from those failed compatibility screenings, Umbrella developed an alternative program specifically for subjects who had undergone partial T-virus infection without achieving the full Tyrant profile. The Bandersnatch Project. The resulting creatures, deployed in significant numbers on Rockfort Island and the Umbrella Antarctic Transport Terminal, during the events of Resident Evil Code Veronica, were fundamentally incomplete. Each Bandersnatch was characterized by severe underdevelopment of one arm, which in many specimens had failed to grow beyond a vestigial nub, while the other arm had developed into something startling. A long, elastic, stretching limb capable of extending to unreasonable lengths, snapping out to grapple, strike, or drag targets from distances that made evasion extremely difficult. They were never meant to be the final product. They were the fallback, what Umbrella did with the raw material that didn't meet the specifications for something better. That they ended up deployed alongside full T-103 models says something about how Umbrella priced human life in their research economy. The Tyrant R's Quiet Rebellion. Of all the Tyrant variants developed during Raccoon City's final chaotic weeks in 1998, the Tyrant R holds a distinction that is unsettling in a way that goes beyond raw biological horror. It was created as an experimental T-103 derivative, fitted with 2 claws and a cybernetic control system, designed to allow direct external command input. A technology intended to address the intelligence problem from a mechanical rather than biological direction. That system should have made it more obedient than any Tyrant before it. Instead, the Tyrant R overheard a researcher casually mentioning that an explosive device had been surgically implanted in its body as a failsafe, a kill switch intended to be triggered if the creature ever got out of hand. The Tyrant R processed that information, and then it acted on it. It turned on the researcher. It was not a mindless attack driven by viral confusion. It was something closer to self-preservation, a decision made in response to discovered information. The creature that Umbrella had built a cybernetic control system into had used that enhanced processing capacity to become aware of its own vulnerability and respond accordingly. In the events of Resident Evil Outbreak File 2, it was ultimately terminated by Ada Wong. The TALOS armor-bolted to living flesh. The TALOS represented the most ambitious and arguably the most grotesque single Tyrant project Umbrella ever completed. The fundamental concept, bolting powered military armor directly onto the living body of a Tyrant, raised engineering challenges that required the research team to solve problems no one had ever confronted before. Standard Tyrants were already nearly impervious to small arms fire, but conventional military hardware, armored vehicles, heavy artillery, attack helicopters could reliably neutralize them. The TALOS was Umbrella USA's answer to that gap, a project designed to produce a single organism capable of engaging and defeating armored military assets in open combat. The T-011 subject, one of the original Arclay laboratory Tyrants, served as the biological core. Onto that living chassis, the Arclay team grafted internal reinforcement implants, enhanced armor modules, and a shoulder-mounted multiple rocket launcher system with homing capability. The weapons were integrated with the creature's biology rather than simply attached to it, fed by and coordinated with the organism's own nervous and muscular systems. The result was something that felt less like a weapon and more like an entire weapons platform wearing the skin of a man. The TALOS's computer control problem. One of the most revealing aspects of the TALOS project is what it was explicitly designed to solve. The Arclay research team described their core motivation in clear terms. Most existing Tyrants including the impressive T-103 line, had a fundamental flaw they called lack of control. Tyrants had a tendency toward progressive or runaway cellular mutation, changes in biology that could, given enough time or damage, override their programming and render them uncontrollable. The TALOS addressed this through a computer control system that operated concurrently with the biological host, providing an external override mechanism that could counter the creature's own instincts if they began to conflict with mission parameters. In essence, the research team gave the most heavily armed tyrant ever produced the most sophisticated leash ever designed, because they understood that creating something that could defeat a military helicopter and then lose control of it would represent a problem considerably larger than any they had previously faced. Sergei Vladimir extracted the TALOS prototype personally from the Spencer Mansion during the chaos of the 1998 Arclay incident, carrying it to safety before the facility's self-destruction. The Hypnos name and what it means. Commander Vincent Goldman of Sheena Island named his experimental tyrant after Hypnos, the Greek god of sleep, the deity whose domain was the quiet suspension of consciousness, the border state between waking life and whatever lay beyond it. The word appears in the creature's official designation, the Hypnos T-type. The choice of name reflects Goldman's broader ambitions and the eugenicist philosophy that drove the entire Hypnos project. He wasn't simply trying to build a better weapon. He was, in his own framing, attempting to create a superior life form, something that had been refined through an artificial simulation of evolutionary pressure, stripped of weakness at the cellular level and left only with strength. Naming it after the god of sleep carries a layer of meaning that reads differently depending on how you approach it, as the thing that descends on the unprepared, that takes hold without warning, that no amount of vigilance can fully prevent. The Hypnos T-type went through 3 distinct mutation stages during its final confrontation with Ark Thompson, each form more powerful than the last, until a helicopter-fired Sidewinder missile found the creature's heart, cavity mid-leap, and ended it over the smoking ruins of Sheena Island. Tyrant 091. When the T+G experiment partially failed, not all of the research conducted with the experimental T+G virus strain, the fusion of T virus and a G virus antibody developed at Umbrella's Loire laboratory, produced the spectacular results that Morpheus Duval would later achieve. The first test subject for this viral strain was a standard T103 that the research team designated Tyrant 091, named directly after the strain's version number, version 0.9.1. The results were partial and in several important ways disappointing. The T+G virus in this earlier form failed to produce the bioelectric generation capability that the research team had theorized the G component would enable. Instead, the T103 host developed an unusual suite of G-specific mutations, most notably tentacles emerging from its hands rather than the standard claws expected from a T-virus tyrant, and a re-emergence of the exposed heart, characteristic that the T103 line had largely moved past. The creature was biologically unusual, but not the electromagnetic marvel Umbrella had hoped to create. It was destroyed when the Spencer Rain cruise ship it was housed aboard crashed during the events of Resident Evil Dead Aim, leaving the data from its failure to inform the refinements that produced version 0.9.2. Morpheus Duval and the Tyrant who kept their mind. The relationship between the Tyrant project and human intelligence had always been a story of compromise. Either the virus destroyed cognition and produce something powerful but mindless, or extreme measures were taken to preserve enough neural function for basic command compliance. Morpheus Duval, the obsessive, beauty-fixated former Umbrella executive who injected themselves with the refined T+G virus in 2002, achieved something that Umbrella's formal research had never managed to produce: a complete and successful transformation into a Tyrant-class organism with no loss of memory, personality, or intelligence whatsoever. The T+G virus's G component suppressed the brain damage effects that made standard T-virus transformations so cognitively destructive. Morpheus retained their full faculties, their grandiose self-perception, their awareness of exactly what they had become and why. They also gained a bioelectric field strong enough to deflect conventional ballistic rounds, making standard firearms entirely useless against them. The only weapon capable of penetrating that electromagnetic barrier was a specially developed charged particle rifle constructed by their own followers. Morpheus remained articulate, purposeful, and recognizably themselves until the accumulated damage of their encounters with Bruce McGivern caused the G-virus component to finally cascade out of control, triggering the same pattern of runaway transformation that had consumed William Birkin before them. The tyrant in the CG films, Damnation's political statement, the 2012 CG animated film Resident Evil, Damnation placed tyrants in a context no previous installment had attempted: a civil war in a fictional post-Soviet nation called the Eastern Slav Republic, used as weapons of political suppression by an authoritarian president named Svetlana Belikova. The tyrants deployed in that film, bearing the shoulder designations 008, 013, and 016, suggesting the existence of a larger series, are not Umbrella products. They are black market acquisitions, purchased by a government from sources that had obtained T-103 models, or derivatives following Umbrella's collapse. Their use in the film carries a pointed message that the film's writer, Shotaro Suga, has discussed openly. Bioweapons, once created and released into an unregulated world, do not disappear with the corporations that made them. They become commodities. They move through channels of trade and political ambition. A tyrant that failed its mission in Raccoon City in 1998 might, through a sufficiently long chain of transactions, end up sealed in a storage capsule beneath a presidential palace in 2011, waiting to be activated against a civilian rebellion. The Eastern Slav Republic tyrants were ultimately destroyed by a joint American and Russian military intervention. But the film's point was about what had already happened before the tanks arrived. The Eastern Slav tyrants, shoulder numbers, and unfinished production. The three tyrants deployed in the Eastern Slav Republic during Resident Evil. Damnation bore specific numbering visible on their shoulders: 008, 013, and 016. Those batch designations imply that at least 16 specimens of this particular unidentified series were produced at some point, and that the three Belikova possessed represented a subset of a larger catalogue. Whether the other numbered units were destroyed, decommissioned, acquired by other parties, or simply still in storage somewhere within the vast and largely unaccounted for network of Umbrella facilities that survived the corporation's official demise, is never addressed in canon. The three active specimens demonstrated capabilities consistent with modified T-103 variants, capable of voluntary super-tyrant transformation under certain circumstances, rather than requiring the standard destruction of the power limiter coat, which suggests the model had been refined past the baseline T-103 design in ways that gave individual units more direct control over their own mutation processes. Leon Kennedy and rebel commander Alexander Kozachenko destroyed one with combined effort. The other two were eliminated by the joint invasion air assets that ended the Civil War. The parasite super tyrant, when the science collided accidentally. In the non-canonical Resident Evil, Operation Raccoon City, the experimental setting allowed for a scenario that the main game series had only gestured toward in theory. What would happen if a Nemesis-type parasite attached itself to an already existing T-103 tyrant that was mid-mission and had not been prepared for parasitization? The answer was the parasite super tyrant, an accidental fusion created when an NE-beta parasite, a variant of the Nemesis alpha strain, latched onto an incapacitated T-103 in a BOW programming lab during the Raccoon City outbreak. The creature that resulted was distinctly different from either a standard super tyrant or a Nemesis T-type. The parasitization immediately destroyed the power limiter, triggering a super tyrant level physical transformation, while the parasite's biology added its own structural changes on top of that mutation. The resulting organism was enormous, disproportionately powerful, and possessed of the kind of instability that comes from two incompatible biological systems being forced into coexistence by accident rather than by a decade of careful scientific refinement. Jabberwock S3, the tyrant blueprint in enemy hands. The Jabberwock S3 creatures encountered in Resident Evil. The Darkside Chronicles represent something genuinely disturbing about the Tyrant Project's legacy. The research that Umbrella developed and guarded for years had, by 2002, made its way into the hands of a rival organization willing to repurpose it for an entirely different biological substrate. The Jabberwock was created using the T. veronica virus as its primary mutagen, rather than the standard T virus strain, but the development methodology it was built on, the same tyrant creation process involving genetic manipulation, hormonal augmentation, and the suppression of weaker cellular lines, was directly adapted from Umbrella's Bandersnatch research, which was itself derived from failed tyrant compatibility screening data. The resulting creatures inherited the tyrant lineage's most characteristic structural signature, an exposed heart that served as an obvious and exploitable weak point. They also retained intelligence sufficient to deliberately shield that weakness during combat, covering the organ with their multiple scythe-like limbs when threatened. The fact that they recognized their own vulnerability and took protective action put them functionally in the same behavioral category as Nemesis, a tyrant-derived intelligence that could adapt its tactics in response to what it observed in an opponent. Capcom's trial and error design process. The physical designs of the tyrant creatures across the Resident Evil series were not arrived at through a single coherent creative vision. They were the product of an iterative experimental process that Capcom artists have discussed in various development retrospectives and official guides. The T-002's iconic anatomy, the exposed heart on the right chest, the enormous claws, the overall silhouette of something that was once human and no longer quite is, emerged from multiple rounds of design exploration, with Capcom's team testing different proportions, different anatomical details, and different degrees of visible mutation before arriving at the final form. The T-103's comparatively humanoid appearance, which functions as an elegant contrast to the T-002's grotesque exposure, was itself a deliberate design statement. This was a creature designed to pass for human at a distance, to operate in environments where a visible monster would immediately cause the kind of panic that would compromise the mission. The visual progression from T-001 to T-002 to T-103 to to the various experimental models represents not just in-universe biological evolution, but Capcom's creative understanding that horror in Resident Evil works best when it plays with the distance between familiar and monstrous. Nemesis's design intent, rough and exposed by purpose. Nemesis's appearance was designed specifically by Yoshinori Matsushita, under instructions from director Kazuhiro Aoyama, who wanted a figure that communicated an intimidating, weapon-carrying physical build, something that would heighten the fear of pursuit in a way that felt qualitatively different from any previous Tyrant. Matsushita went through several concepts before the final design emerged, exploring different degrees of surface damage, different clothing options, and different approaches to the exposed muscle aesthetic that characterizes the final creature. One early direction considered a protective vest rather than the iconic coat. Another explored a fully nude design more similar to earlier Tyrant models. The coat and the exposed facial musculature won out. The stitching over Nemesis's right eye, which covers the physical damage inflicted when the NE-alpha parasite tore the host body open during implantation, was specifically included to visually communicate that this creature was a prototype, unfinished, forcibly assembled, made functional through intervention rather than clean engineering. Matsushita has noted that the final mutation form, when Nemesis's body catastrophically degrades into a massive crawling mass, was the most difficult design challenge of the entire project, requiring extensive work to make it feel genuinely unique rather than simply large. The 2020 remake's Plaga retcon. When Capcom reimagined Resident Evil 3 for 2020, the development team made a choice about the NE-alpha parasite's origins that quietly updated the lore in a way that connected the game more directly to the rest of the modern series. In the original 1999 game, the Nemesis parasite was presented as an entirely original Umbrella Europe creation, a genetically engineered species developed specifically for the Nemesis project. In the 2020 remake, this origin was partially revised. The NE-alpha is now framed as a genetically engineered copy of Las Plagas, the parasitic species that would later feature prominently in Resident Evil 4's setting of rural Spain. That connection retroactively implies a line of research continuity between Umbrella Europe's 1980s parasite work and the much older, naturally occurring Plagas organism that Spanish researcher Luis Serra Navarro had studied at Umbrella's 6th laboratory before moving on to work in the village where Leon Kennedy would eventually find himself. It is a lore adjustment that has both admirers and critics among the fan base, but its in-universe logic is internally consistent. If the Nemesis Project researchers had access to knowledge of Las Plagas as a reference organism, using it as a genetic template for the NE-alpha makes scientific sense within the series' own framework. The fear of the fedora, how a hat redefined a monster. In the original 1998 Resident Evil 2, T-00 wore a trench coat and nothing else on its head. The bare, pale, expressionless face above the dark leather of the coat was its identity. Anonymous, featureless, impossible to read. When Capcom's team rebuilt the character for the 2019 remake, someone added a fedora. It is a detail that sounds in isolation like it should make the character less frightening. A 7-foot bioweapon in a hat should be absurd. Instead, it became one of the defining visual decisions of the entire remake. The hat transforms T-00 from something monstrous into something that evokes the visual language of noir fiction and classic Hollywood menace, a figure of old-fashioned, implacable threat rendered at scale. The fedora was never explained within the game's fiction. There is no file, no piece of in-universe documentation that accounts for the hat. Creative director Kazunori Kadoi has said in interviews that the development team had no idea the remake's Mr. X would become the cultural phenomenon it did. The fedora was one detail among many. It turned out to be the one that lodged in the collective memory of an entire generation of survival horror players. Mr. X became an internet meme and surprised his creators. When Resident Evil 2's remake launched in January 2019, the development team had built T-00 specifically to be terrifying. An ever-present, inescapable force that changed the texture of the entire game. What they didn't anticipate was that the internet would fall deeply, chaotically in love with him. Mr. X became a meme within days of release, with players across social media combining footage of his slow, deliberate pursuit with the 2002 DMX single X Gon Give It To Ya. A piece of synchronization so immediately obvious and so deeply funny that it spread to hundreds of thousands of people who had never played the game. Fans created mods that added the song to the game itself, triggering every time he appeared on screen. Other fans created mods that removed him entirely, because the constant tension of his presence was genuinely too much. Creative director Kazunori Kadoi told interviewers afterward that he had no idea Mr. X would be a sensation, and that the reaction genuinely surprised the team. The character, who was designed as pure, concentrated survival horror fear, became simultaneously one of survival horror's most beloved figures and one of gaming's most recognizable comedy subjects. Mr. X Goes Domestic, the Monster Hunter crossover. The cultural reach of Mr. X after the 2019 remake's release extended well beyond meme culture. In October 2019, Capcom launched a crossover event between Resident Evil 2 and Monster Hunter World, Iceborne, a game set in a lush, prehistoric wilderness ecosystem where players hunt enormous creatures for sport and materials. The crossover brought Leon Kennedy and Claire Redfield costumes to Monster Hunter's World, along with zombie status effects and various Resident Evil-themed items. The centerpiece, however, was something that could only exist in the specific moment of Mr. X's post-meme popularity. A skin that reskinned the player's handler companion, the cheerful support character who stays at base camp, manages quests, and enthusiastically prepares meals to look exactly like the T-00 tyrant. The most feared stalker in recent survival horror history was now standing at the cooking pot in Monster Hunter's cozy base camp, making food and tracking mission logistics, his expressionless fedora-wearing face rendered in chipper high-fidelity graphics. It is, by almost any measure, the strangest deployment of a tyrant in Resident Evil's history. The tyrant that almost joined a fighting game. Resident Evil's tyrants have occasionally approached the world of crossover fighting games without quite making it through the door. The most well-documented near miss came with Marvel vs. Capcom 3. Fate of Two Worlds, the 2011 crossover fighting game that assembled characters from both publishers' universes into one roster. Capcom's development team considered adding a tyrant as a playable character. The concept got far enough into development that it was seriously evaluated before ultimately being rejected. The reason cited was concern about the game's ESRB rating, a tyrant's visual design and combat style, built around grotesque biological violence, apparently raised enough content concerns that including the character risked a rating impact that the team was not willing to absorb. The Nemesis T-type, however, did eventually make it to a fighting game roster. Nemesis was added as a playable character in Ultimate Marvel versus Capcom 3. The expanded version of the same game released later in 2011, where its combination of enormous physical presence and rocket launcher attacks made it one of the more distinctive additions to the roster. The Tatsunoko vs. Capcom Near Miss, the Marvel vs. Capcom 3 situation was not the only time a Tyrant was seriously considered for a fighting game, and ultimately didn't make the cut. Tatsunoko vs. Capcom, Ultimate All-Stars, the 2010 crossover between Capcom's characters and those of the Japanese animation studio Tatsunoko Production, also had a Tyrant under consideration for the playable roster at some point during development. Unlike the Marvel situation, no specific reason has been publicly confirmed for why the concept was dropped. Which Tyrant model was being considered was also never confirmed. It was simply described as a Tyrant, leaving whether the intended character was a T-002, a T-103, a Nemesis, or something else entirely up to speculation. The character was ultimately not included, leaving Tyrants absent from the crossover fighting game genre entirely, until Nemesis's eventual Marvel vs. Capcom 3 inclusion. Resident Evil 5's Ghost Tyrant. One of the most unusual entries in Tyrant history is a creature that exists only in concept, documented in developer materials and discussed in retrospectives, but never seen by a single player in a shipped product. During the early development stages of Resident Evil 5, the team was working with a Tyrant-like creature that would have been infected with the Ouroboros virus, the same mutagenic agent that drives the game's main storyline as a weapon intended to enact global eugenics. The early concept envisioned Excella Gione, the game's primary villain up to a certain point, dying not through the method used in the final game, but by being killed by this Ouroboros Tyrant hybrid, specifically by being stabbed through the torso in a manner visually reminiscent of how the T-002 stabbed Albert Wesker in the original Resident Evil. The concept was cut before the game reached its final form. No images of the creature in question appear to have been publicly released. Its existence is known primarily through descriptions in development materials and passing references in interviews. A Tyrant that almost was, carrying the biological fingerprints of a virus that itself represented the culmination of everything Spencer had been trying to achieve with the original progenitor research. Two types of Tyrant, infiltration and combat. Umbrella's product documentation for the Tyrant project classified the commercial offerings into two fundamental categories that reflected the different strategic needs of their intended buyers. The first was the combat type, a creature optimized entirely for direct physical engagement, massive strength, maximum durability, and the capacity to absorb and survive damage from the kinds of weapons that the people it was being sent against would typically carry. The T-002 represented the earliest combat type specimen, and most of the experimental variants, Thanatos, Hypnos, T-Arlos, built on this framework. The second was the infiltration type, a creature designed to pass for human in the spaces where it was deployed, conducting missions that required presence in environments where a visible monster would immediately compromise the operation. The T-103 and its derivatives were the primary infiltration type product. Their relatively human silhouettes and the visual suppression provided by the power limiter coat, allowing them to move through spaces, buildings, corridors, vehicles, without the immediate sensory alarm that something like the T-002 would trigger. T-00's deployment to the Raccoon City Police Department was an infiltration-type mission, even though the creature's eventual confrontation with Leon and Claire involved direct combat. The trench coat was the uniform of plausible humanity. The thing wearing it was anything but. The Tyrant's zombie distinction. Intelligence as the separator. The quality that separates a Tyrant from every other T-virus infectant, from Cerberus specimens to standard zombies to lickers, is not physical size, not regenerative capability, not mutation potential. It is intelligence. Zombies are, in Umbrella's own clinical assessment, biologically failed weapons, humans who lacked the genetic compatibility for Tyrant creation, whose neural tissue was consumed by the viral infection in the standard pattern, leaving something that moved and attacked and could transmit the virus further, but could not follow orders, could not navigate complex environments purposefully, could not make decisions in any meaningful cognitive sense. The Tyrant emerged specifically from the project's effort to preserve cognitive function through infection, to find, through genetic screening and surgical intervention and pharmaceutical support, a path through T-virus exposure that left enough of a mind intact to be directed, that this mind was then deliberately limited, kept just functional enough to execute orders, not developed enough to truly exercise autonomous judgment, was a calculated product decision. Umbrella didn't want soldiers who could question their missions. They wanted soldiers who couldn't. The NE Alpha's failure rate. One detail that gets lost in the Nemesis project's eventual success is how consistently and completely the NE Alpha parasite killed its early hosts. Every test subject, every BOW that the project used as a candidate for parasitization in the late 1980s died. The parasite was too aggressive. Its metabolic demands exceeded what any existing organism could sustain during the coupling process. The window of survival was 5 minutes from implantation. 5 minutes for the host's biology to either accommodate the parasite or be overwhelmed by it. And in every test case through the project's early years, the host was overwhelmed. That streak of total failure continued even when the parasite was tested on BOWs from more advanced projects, Cerberus variants, hunter specimens, with results that the team found only marginally useful. The breakthrough that eventually came, identifying the T103 as a host with sufficient biological mass and resilience to survive the coupling, required nearly a decade of iterative refinement of the parasite itself, progressively reducing its initial aggression while maintaining the intelligence-enhancing properties that made the project worthwhile. By the time the Nemesis T-type was deployed in Raccoon City in 1998, 101 failed experiments had been erased in favor of one that worked. Whether those failed experiments were documented thoroughly enough to be meaningful is a detail that Umbrella's files do not fully address. The connections and the T501, $120 million and 30 years later. After the fall of Umbrella, the vacuum it left in the bioweapons market was eventually filled by organizations with less history, but similar ambitions, and one of the most significant of these was the Connections, a group that served as both a bioweapons developer and a black market broker, moving bioorganic weapons through channels that reached criminal organizations, rogue states, and private interests with money and willingness to spend it. When the Connections decided to create their flagship product, the model they chose as their reference was the T103, specifically the version that had famously confronted Leon Kennedy and Claire Redfield in Raccoon City in 1998. The resulting creature, designated T501, was nearly identical to its source in physical design. The same broad silhouette, the same power limiter coat designed for effective human disguise, the same capacity for super tyrant mutation when the coat was destroyed. The price listed in the Connections product catalog for a single T501 unit was $120 million. It was deployed in the ruins of Raccoon City in 2026 under the command of a high-ranking member called Zeno, sent specifically to kill Leon Kennedy, the same federal agent who had survived the original T-103 encounter 28 years earlier. The T-501 came very close. The T-501 versus an older Leon. The encounter between Leon Kennedy and the T-501 in Resident Evil Requiem in 2026 carried a resonance that the game's developers appeared to have intended deliberately. Leon was first confronted by a T-103 in 1998 as a rookie police officer on his first day of work in a city that was already overrun. He was 21 years old, armed with whatever he could find, and survived largely through a combination of improvisation and extraordinary fortune. 28 years later, returning to the ruins of Raccoon City in 2026, he found himself pursued through the same police station, building by something that looked almost identical to the creature that had stalked him as a young man. The T-501 pursued him through the east wing of the station's ruins before the confrontation escalated to an open arena fight. This time, Leon had decades of fieldwork, combat experience across multiple major bioterrorism incidents, and significantly more sophisticated weaponry. He fought the creature into its super tyrant transformation, and then destroyed its exposed heart, without requiring Ada Wong to drop a rocket launcher on him from above. The T-501's defeat was, in a quiet way, a measure of the distance between the man Leon had been and the man he had become. The Nemesis Gamma in the Connections catalog, the same Connections product catalog that listed the T-501 for $120 million also, offered something called the CM-NE-Gamma-001, a product description that references the NE-alpha parasite, originally developed by Umbrella Europe, and frames a modified mass production version as a direct commercial offering. The catalogue entry describes it as an improvement focused on cost reduction and performance enhancement, with repeated developmental iterations producing significant boost to physical ability and recovery, regardless of the host's baseline durability. The Nemesis project, which Umbrella Europe had worked on for over a decade and which had produced only a single combat-deployed specimen before the Raccoon City disaster ended the program, had apparently been reverse-engineered sufficiently for a post-Umbrella organization to offer its derivatives as catalog items with negotiable pricing. The technology that took 10 years and required a specific T-103 host prepared through extensive surgical intervention was now, 3 decades later, a commodity. Nemesis in Resident Evil Survivor 2, the secret boss. The Nemesis T-Type's documented combat deployments extend beyond Raccoon City through a detail buried in the relatively obscure light gun spin-off Resident Evil Survivor 2, Code Veronica. In that game's systems, if a player completes a scenario within the time limit, Nemesis will not appear during it. If they fail to meet the time threshold, Nemesis materializes and pursues them with the same relentless intent it brought to Jill Valentine in the original game, and it will kill the player instantly if it makes contact. The game also contains a hidden boss version of Nemesis that can be encountered under specific conditions at the end of a completed run, this time armed with a rocket launcher, rather than engaging purely in physical combat. The inclusion of Nemesis as a secret bonus challenge, with the rocket launcher as its defining attribute for that encounter, was a deliberate nod to one of the creature's most iconic moments in the main series. The shot that brought down a helicopter, the weapon that turned a pursuit monster into something that could engage aerial targets from the ground. Victor Gideon and the NE Gamma self-injection. The NE alpha parasite story does not end with Nemesis's destruction in Raccoon City. A related species, the NE gamma, developed in secret aboard the research vessel Ark as a means of mass-producing a version of the Nemesis concept at lower cost, became the basis for an extraordinary individual choice made by a scientist named Victor Gideon. Gideon, a researcher working on the Nemesis project's successor work, chose to inject himself with an NE gamma parasite, essentially undertaking a voluntary version of the same process that had been forced upon the T-103 host that became Nemesis. Unlike that forced coupling, Gideon's self-injection was chosen, prepared for, and survived with his full mental faculties intact. The NE gamma granted him significantly enhanced physical characteristics and regenerative abilities, while allowing him to retain his identity, his memories, and his cognition completely. He became something the Nemesis project had never achieved with its primary subject. A human being who had invited the parasite in and come out the other side still recognizably themselves, stronger, harder to kill, and still capable of conversation. Pluto, the tyrant that wasn't quite, the creature known as Pluto, encountered in Resident Evil Dead Aim, occupies a complicated position in the tyrant taxonomy. Umbrella classified it as a failed bioweapons experiment, a man identified only by the designation Alpha, a death row inmate who agreed to participate in what he was told was a pharmaceutical trial, brought to an island facility in the Atlantic and confined there for a month before the experiment was initiated. The resulting mutation produced something that was, in several important ways, tyrant adjacent, but not strictly a tyrant. Pluto was massive, heavily mutated, and possessed of significant physical threat. It was also effectively blind. The mutation had sealed its eyes entirely, leaving it to navigate by sound and other sensory input. That sensory limitation, combined with the specific circumstances of its creation, placed it outside the clean lineage of the Tyrant project, while retaining enough of the project's visual and behavioral language to be unmistakably related to it. Umbrella's assessment was that the experiment had failed. Pluto's existence suggests that the line between failure and product in Umbrella's research philosophy was drawn primarily by commercial viability, rather than by what the subject had become. What bullets actually do to a tyrant. One of the most quietly disturbing facts about tyrant biology, stated with clinical directness in Umbrella's own research files, is that conventional firearms are not actually insufficient weapons against a tyrant. They simply require more ammunition than most combatants would carry. Standard small arms fire does cause damage to a tyrant's biology. The problem is that the creature's regenerative systems operate fast enough to partially compensate for incoming damage in real time, meaning that the rate of tissue damage from gunfire competes with the rate of tissue repair, and at normal rates of fire, repair tends to win. Sustained concentrated fire at vulnerable areas, particularly the exposed heart, common to several tyrant models, can overwhelm the regeneration, which is why consistent aiming toward that point is the documented effective strategy for creatures like the T-002. What makes the T-103 models so exceptionally durable by comparison is the combination of their superior regenerative capability and the absence of the T-002's obvious external weak point. Their cardiovascular system is not grotesquely exposed, forcing combatants to deal damage without a single high-priority target to concentrate on. The Super Tyrant form's exposed heart is therefore not just a horror design element. It is, in lore terms, a genuine consequence of the mutation's biological reorganization. and it is the reason rocket launchers became the documented solution. The Tyrant that appeared in SNK versus Capcom. The reach of the Tyrant concept into non-Resident Evil media extends to a card game that most people who know the franchise have never heard of. SNK versus Capcom, Card Fighters DS, a Nintendo DS release, included a Tyrant card in its card pool. A small, easily overlooked inclusion that nonetheless marks the character's presence in a crossover product entirely outside the survival horror genre. The card represents the creature's status within Capcom's broader intellectual property catalogue at the time. Recognizable enough to be useful as a contribution to a crossover product, iconic enough within that context to carry meaning without requiring extensive explanation. A Tyrant card in a card game built around recognizable characters from both companies implies that someone at Capcom made a decision that the Tyrant, in card form, would mean something to a player base that extended beyond core Resident Evil fans. Whether that decision proved correct commercially is a separate question from the fact that it was made. The TOO2 stabbed its creator. A thread that runs through almost every documented Tyrant encounter is the creature's relationship to the people responsible for its existence. The T-001 was placed in storage and marked for disposal by the same scientists who built it. The T-002 was kept in a tank and observed as property until Wesker chose to use it as a murder weapon pointed at his own teammates. Neither creature had been given any reason to perceive the humans around it as anything other than either prey or irrelevant. And yet, the T-002's first deliberate act upon release was to turn toward Wesker specifically, before engaging the STARS members. The canon documents that the creature recognized Wesker as a participant in the Tyrant project, which, based on what we know of the T-002's intelligence level, could imply that it retained enough awareness of its own history to respond to its creators differently than it responded to strangers. What is documented is that the creature Wesker intended to use as his own instrument attacked him first, and the wound it inflicted was severe enough that he appeared dead by standard medical assessment, which was, of course, precisely the cover he needed. The T-002 achieved the functional outcome of Wesker's plan, even through the act of attacking him. That particular irony is undeniably fitting. The difference between every Tyrant and every zombie. There is one final clarifying fact that underlies every entry in the Tyrant's history, and it is one that Umbrella's researchers stated explicitly in their internal documentation. The distance between a zombie and a Tyrant is not primarily physical. It is about what the T-virus chose to preserve. In most human subjects, the virus pursues the path of least resistance, destroying neural tissue, converting the subject into something that can still move and transmit infection, but cannot make decisions, cannot follow instructions, cannot be pointed at a target with any expectation that it will stay pointed. Tyrants emerged from the project's determination to find the exceptions to that pattern. Every Tyrant that existed was a human being whose body and mind, through some combination of rare genetic compatibility and careful scientific management, threaded the needle between total infection and total cognitive collapse. The result was a creature that retained just enough of what made human beings dangerous: intelligence, purpose, the capacity for deliberate action, while shedding the things that made them difficult to deploy as weapons: conscience, autonomy, the inclination to ask questions about the work they were being sent to do. Tyrants are the Tyrant Project's answer to the question of what you get when you keep exactly enough of a person to make them useful and discard everything else. Sheena Island's Vincent Goldman and his own tyrant problem. Vincent Goldman, the man who designed the Hypnos T-type experiment and believed it would elevate him to the pinnacle of Umbrella's corporate hierarchy, was simultaneously running a facility that was producing standard T-103 tyrants for the corporation's commercial catalog. The Sheena Island facility was Umbrella's primary tyrant manufacturing plant, the Tyrant Plant, and Goldman commanded it with a fanaticism that extended to deliberately triggering a T-virus outbreak across the island's civilian population when he believed local residents were about to report his misconduct to Umbrella headquarters. He released multiple incomplete T-103 units into the outbreak as both combat assets and as measures to silence survivors. These units, pulled from the production line before they had reached full development, were notably less durable and intelligent than completed specimens, and could be dispatched more readily with small arms, which speaks to how much the production process mattered to the final product's quality. Goldman was eventually killed by Ark Thompson, the private investigator Umbrella had sent to the island to gather evidence on him, before Thompson destroyed the Hypnos T-type as well. The entire Sheena Island operation collapsed in a single incident that cost Umbrella both its primary production facility and its most ambitious experimental tyrant simultaneously. The wetlands suspension tanks at Nest 2. Jill Valentine's ordeal during the Raccoon City outbreak included a moment documented in the game's records that sits uncomfortably alongside everything established about T-103 production and deployment. At some point during her confrontation with Nemesis, Jill found herself inside Nest 2, Umbrella's second underground facility in the Raccoon City area, housed beneath Spencer Memorial Hospital. Within that facility, she encountered multiple tyrants stored in suspension tanks, not deployed, not active, simply held in storage. The files and documentation available in that area do not definitively identify these stored specimens as T-103s or as some other prototype series. Their presence implies that Umbrella had been stockpiling tyrant specimens in facilities throughout the Raccoon City area beyond what was accounted for in official deployment records, and that the complete sterilization of Raccoon City, which neutralized the 6 deployed T-103s and destroyed the Nemesis T-type, may have also erased an undocumented inventory of unactivated specimens whose existence was never formally acknowledged. The Tyrant as a commercial product. What buyers were actually purchasing. Umbrella's internal marketing framing for the Tyrant as a commercial BOW product is worth examining in its own right, because it reveals something about how the corporation understood the thing it had made. The pitch, distilled from their product documentation, was essentially this. Here is a creature that possesses near-human intelligence and therefore can be directed toward complex missions. Here is a creature that can absorb weapons fire that would stop any conventional soldier. Here is a creature that cannot question its orders or change its mind or be talked out of its assignment. The commercial value of a tyrant was not its violence. Exactly. Violence could be achieved through simpler and cheaper means. The commercial value was the combination of obedience and survivability, a weapon that would keep moving toward its objective through circumstances that would cause a human operative to disengage, retreat, or simply die. For the governments and organizations that Umbrella was targeting as customers, the Tyrant represented something they had always wanted and never been able to fully produce through conventional military means. Absolute reliability in the face of resistance. The Tyrant body's unusual cardiovascular demands. The T-002's surgical heart graft. The large animal heart bolted onto the right chest cavity to provide a supplemental circulatory system. was not merely a cosmetic or even a structural choice. It addressed a genuine biological problem that Umbrella's researchers had identified during the T-002's development. The mutations required to produce tyrant-level musculature and physical capability created metabolic demands on the cardiovascular system that a single human heart couldn't reliably sustain. The volume of blood flow required to keep the T-002's enlarged and mutated body functional under the physical stresses of combat would have outpaced what its original heart could deliver. The grafted heart solved this by providing redundant circulatory capacity, essentially giving the creature two separate pumping systems that could compensate for each other if either were damaged. That the graft was surgically external and therefore visually exposed was an acknowledged weakness that the research team noted but accepted because the alternative, a fully internal placement, was beyond the surgical capabilities available at the Arclay laboratory at the time of the T-002's development. Later, Tyrant models addressed this through genetic engineering rather than surgery, building the cardiovascular enhancements in from the beginning. What power limiter actually means in Umbrella's terminology. The phrase power limiter has become so associated with the trench coat worn by T-103 models that it is easy to forget that the underlying concept, the suppression of progressive mutation in a tyrant host, preceded the coat's invention and was approached differently in earlier specimens. The T-001 had no power limiter at all, which contributed to its failure as a specimen. Without any suppression mechanism, the T-virus continued working on the subject after the initial viable tyrant form was achieved, degrading the nervous system further and reducing the creature's already limited functionality. The T-002 was the first tyrant for which a power limiter was developed, and it was an internal mechanism rather than an external garment. The device was built into the creature's biology at the point of development rather than worn on its body. When the T-103 design required a limiter that could be more practically implemented for mass production, the engineering team arrived at the coat, an external device that could be manufactured standardly, fitted without surgery, and replaced if damaged. The coat is therefore a practical mass production solution to a biological engineering problem. It is also, incidentally, the reason that super tyrant transformations only occur under extreme damage conditions. Destroying the coat means destroying the limiter, and the mutation that follows is not an upgrade. It is a failure mode. Umbrella's medical cover story. The Umbrella Corporation's public identity was that of a pharmaceutical giant, a global healthcare company that discovered and developed medicines, vaccines, and treatments. The Tyrant Project, the T-virus research that underpinned it, and every BOW development program Umbrella ran existed under that cover with the active blessing and complicity of elements within the United States government, who classified the research as legitimate military bioweapons development under programs that flagrantly violated the 1972 Biological Weapons Convention. Umbrella's researchers, operating in this protected space, could arrange for convicted criminals to be transferred into their facilities, could abduct teenagers from vulnerable populations for hormone extraction, could conduct decades of lethal human experimentation, all under institutional cover that made formal investigation difficult and whistleblowing nearly impossible. The tyrant that eventually walked through the Raccoon City police department was not a monster that had appeared from nowhere. It had a paper trail, researchers, legal frameworks, government contacts, corporate budgets, a bureaucracy of horror that stretched from boardrooms to underground laboratories. The Tyrant Project's relationship to Spencer's eugenics vision. Oswell E. Spencer, the Earl and Umbrella co-founder whose biological research philosophy underpinned every project the corporation pursued, did not want tyrants purely as weapons to sell. The commercial bioweapons program was a funding mechanism, a way to sustain the research revenue that paid for the deeper ambition, the progenitor virus project, and the dream of replacing humanity with a superior subspecies of his own design. The Tyrant Project fed into this vision in a specific way. Spencer's identification of Sergei Vladimir as a rare compatible candidate, his insistence that Vladimir donate his clones, his personal overseeing of the NE alpha parasite's first Arclay laboratory test. These were not purely commercial decisions. Spencer was building a biological understanding of what made certain human beings exceptional, what genetic profiles allowed survival of processes that killed everyone else, and how those profiles could be harnessed. The T-103's mass production wasn't just about having inventory to sell. It was about demonstrating that the barrier between ordinary human beings and something categorically beyond them could be crossed with sufficient scientific will, and that Spencer intended to be the one who crossed it. Why T-103? Models could track specific scents. One of the more specific and rarely discussed capabilities of the T-103 line, documented in Umbrella's product files, is their capacity to be programmed to track particular scent signatures. This allowed an individual T-103 to be assigned a specific target and then sent into an environment where it would orient toward that scent, rather than simply attacking everything it encountered. T-00's deployment against survivors at the Raccoon City Police Department involved both a general directive to eliminate police officers and a specific programming to locate the G-virus sample in Sherry Birkin's pendant. The scent tracking capability was part of how the creature could be directed toward a specific object or person within a chaotic environment, rather than simply generating indiscriminate violence. Standard zombies, by contrast, responded primarily to sound and movement. They had no capacity for targeted biological tracking of this kind. The T-103's scent programming was one of the clearest practical demonstrations of the intelligence gap between a tyrant and the viral infectants it shared the streets of Raccoon City with. The T-103's failure at its core mission. Despite representing the culmination of a decade of the Tyrant Project's most ambitious research, the T-103 series record in documented field deployments is objectively poor. T-00 failed to recover the G-virus sample that was its primary mission objective. The 5 T-103s deployed against Delta Force at the Raccoon City incineration plant were all destroyed. T-078 failed to eliminate Claire Redfield and was thrown from an aircraft. The Nemesis T-type failed to kill all surviving STARS members and was eventually destroyed by Jill Valentine. The Ivans were defeated by Wesker. The Eastern Slav Republic specimens were neutralized by a combined assault from Leon Kennedy, rebel forces, and an international military intervention. The T-501 was killed in 2026 by the same federal agent who survived a T-103 encounter in 1998. Against trained, determined, resourceful opponents who understood what they were facing and refused to simply freeze in place, tyrants lost consistently. The commercial fantasy of the invincible bioweapon soldier runs directly into a documented reality. Every tyrant ever deployed in a combat situation was eventually stopped. The Tyrant in the Resident Evil stage production. The Tyrant concept migrated into physical performance space through a Japanese stage production called Resident Evil. The stage, which featured a theatrical retelling incorporating elements of Resident Evil 2's events, with a tyrant appearing as one of its antagonists. The production was brought to life through performance techniques and practical staging considerably more modest than the digital environments of the games, but it demonstrated the character's iconic status in a different way. A tyrant could be staged in front of a live audience and still carry something of the same weight of menace through physical presence alone. The production was aimed at Japanese audiences already deeply familiar with the series and its vocabulary of horror, which means the tyrant's appearance on stage required no introduction and no lengthy setup. The audience already knew what it was looking at. That immediate, wordless recognition. The way the tyrant's silhouette and deliberate movement can function as shorthand for a specific kind of dread speaks to how thoroughly the design had embedded itself in the series' cultural identity over decades of encounters. The Arklay Laboratory's final day. The destruction of the Arklay Laboratory on July 25, 1998, was carried out by elements of the Raccoon City Police Department, following the laboratory's identification as the source of the biohazard that had been killing people in the Arklay Mountains. The operation resulted in the deaths of an estimated 127 people inside the facility, 78 Umbrella employees, 23 test subjects, 20 civilians, and 7 Raccoon City police officers. The self-destruct sequence activated during the incident destroyed the underground laboratory, along with the Spencer Mansion complex that concealed it. Within that destruction, the Tyrant project lost the T-002, killed on the helipad by a rocket launcher, along with every piece of physical infrastructure that had been used to develop it. The embryonic clone of the T-002 had already been evacuated, ensuring the project's continuation. But the facility where it had been built, the scientists who had worked on it, and the records stored in its systems were erased by the explosion. Umbrella would rebuild. The Tyrant project would continue. But the specific knowledge that had existed only in the Arklay laboratory was gone, and some of it was never fully recovered.